So we are already correctly binding to these entries and the date picker, which, by the way, is something that we slightly need to change. The date is originally a very, very old date. So let's go ahead and in the constructor immediately set the expense date to be today. So I can just set datetime.today, which is going to easily just set the expense date, the initial expense date, to today's date instead of some date in the 1900. So small change, but it was important. Now, the thing that we're going to do in this lecture is start to bind to collections. Currently, not our picker, not our two list views are displaying anything. So that is what we want to change in this lecture. Starting with the picker. Now this one is actually going to be very straightforward, and I can actually copy what I have in the categories VM, where I already have an observable collection. So I'm going to add this observable collection to my new expense VM right before the constructor. I will need to add a using directive to be able to use that class. And then I'm also going to be getting the categories with this method. So what I will do is simply copy this method and paste it over here as well. So let me go ahead and define it below the insert expense method and just call it from the constructor, just call get categories. So nothing different in here, just the same thing that we already had in the categories VM. Now, one thing we do have to do in here, these new categories of observable collection is the one that should be binding to the picker, but of course, differently to what we have been doing with these other elements. We are not going to be binding so the picker can send information. That is what the selected item does, but the picker actually has an item's source element. That is the one that we want to bind to that new observable collection, which is called categories. So now the picker is going to get its elements from this observable collection. So let's go ahead and test this out before we implement the similar thing for the other observable collections. As the application runs, we can navigate to expenses, to the new expenses. And actually, yeah, I'm forgetting something important again. So I need to, before getting the categories and actually start to work with categories, I need to initialize the categories. So let me get back to the constructor and set categories to a new observable collection of strings. Let me try one more time. I keep forgetting to initialize my observable collections. So here we go again. We navigate to expenses, to the new expense tab, and now notice in the picker we see all of those categories that are coming from the observable collection. And as I select them, let's go ahead and insert a new expense here. Let's say this is going to be travel, and this is going to be some taxi, and this is going to be, let's say, $11. Quick description, taxi to home. And notice that the date is now today, so it makes more sense. Let me actually change this to yesterday, which I can do that. Hit and save. I no longer have my breakpoint, but in this lecture we're going to start listing these elements. So we will take a look if the category was correctly set from that picker. So let's go ahead and do that. I will start with the expenses tab. So let me actually just close this and go over to my expenses view and open my expenses view model as well. In here, I already have these expenses observable collection, which is an observable collection not of a string, but of a specific class. And I'm already getting the expenses, and in here I am initializing already the observable collection, so that's done. But I'm not binding yet. So you should now be very familiar with how we are working with this. The list view is actually also going to contain an item source, similar to what we just saw with that picker. Now in here, the list view doesn't really have a container. It is defined directly into the content. So what we could do is do something very similar to what we did with the command and set the source, or you could also just set the binding context. Let me go ahead and do everything inside of the item source. I am going to set the binding to a static resource source, which is going to be my VM, and I'm going to set the path. And the path, of course, is going to be these expenses of sortable collection. So just like this, my list view is already going to be listing all of the expenses that are being read. But of course, I still need to tell it how is it that it is going to display them. Now, in the picker, we didn't have to do many things because it was directly a collection of strings. And of course, it was very easy for a string to be displayed in a label. But in this case, we do have a complex type. And let me go ahead and open my model in here. We have a complex type that has all of these properties. So I'm pretty sure that the list view has no idea how to display a class that I created myself. So what we will have to do is tell it how is it going to be displaying an expense. Now in here we actually are already defining that it is going to be displaying the expenses through a text cell. So what is going to happen in here is that the list view is going to take a look at its item source and create one text cell for each of the elements in that source. In this case, our sortable collection of expenses. So each text cell is actually going to have a different binding context. It's not going to be the entire collection, it is going to be an individual expense, which means that the text can be binding directly to one of the properties of the expense. Let's say the name. Again, because the context, the binding context of the text cell is no longer going to be the entire collection, the list view is going to be setting it to an individual expense. And in fact, not only do we have the text in a text cell, we also have the detail, which we can of course also bind, and this one I'm going to be binding it to the category. Which means that if we are binding everything correctly, when the expenses are listed, we should see what category they belong to and take a look at that expense that we have just inserted to see if the category was correctly saved. So let me go ahead and run this. And all I have to do is navigate over to expenses and notice that the taxi one that I have just inserted does have that travel category. So that means that our picker is working correctly, that our list view is already working correctly, and that we are correctly displaying everything. Of course, if you remember when I inserted coffee, I didn't have categories yet, so that is why the detail is empty there. But our list view is pretty much working very well. Now, the other list view that I have to work with is a little bit more complicated. So in my categories page, I have a view cell, which is going to work similar enough to the text cell, but in my view model, I am missing a few things. First, I am only getting the list of categories, but what I really need is some sort of list that has both the category and the amount of money that has been spent in that category. And then use the amount per category to calculate the percentage of the overall amount of money that has been spent per category. So basically, I should end up with a list that has in the label, well, in each view cell, the label should read the category, and the progress bar should display the percentage that has been spent in that category from the overall expenses. So basically, if the user has spent $100 and in a certain category they have spent $10, the progress bar should display 10% for that particular category. So let's go ahead and work on that. Now, I won't bore you with the details because I want to focus on just binding to a view cell, which is slightly different to binding to a text cell. But let me go ahead and briefly explain what I'm doing. First, I am going to have a class inside of this class that is going to be the one